Welcome. Before moving on to the story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. In the northern outskirts of the old town of Drywood, there stood a building of stone and timber, worn by time, yet not quite ruined. It was neither large nor small, just broad enough to seem important, but humble enough to be forgotten. Its walls were faded beige, its roof a patchwork of moss-covered tiles. Birds sometimes nested in the cracks between the bricks, and ivy crept slowly up one side, as if it were trying not to disturb the silence. Inside this building, which had once been the town's records office, the air smelled of paper, dust, and something faintly sweet, like the scent of old ink that had dried decades ago, but still lingered on the edges of yellowed parchment. It was in this place that Elias spent his days. He had worked there for 37 years, though he rarely counted them. Each year felt much like the one before it, slow, soft, and untroubled. Elias was a thin man, with silver hair that he kept neatly parted, and small round glasses that perched low on his nose. His face was lined but calm, like the pages of a well-kept ledger. He wore the same kind of clothes every day, a faded brown waistcoat, a gray shirt with stiff cuffs, and wool trousers that made a soft swishing sound when he walked across the stone floor. His shoes were polished, though scuffed near the toes, a result of his habit of tapping them gently against the wooden leg of his desk when deep in thought, which was often, each morning. He arrived precisely at 7:45. The sun would just be clearing the tops of the bare trees, and the town would still be half asleep. The roads would be empty, except for the occasional cart rolling slowly by. Elias would unlock the heavy oak door with a small brass key he kept on a chain around his neck, open it with both hands, and step inside with the same deliberate quietness. He had practiced for decades. He would then light a single candle, always the same one, trimmed each week, and carry it to the main room, where rows of shelves held hundreds upon hundreds of record books. Each book was bound in leather, labeled in black ink, and arranged not alphabetically or by date, but by a system that only Elias understood. If you had asked him to explain it, he would have tried, but his words would likely drift off into thoughts about margins, binding threads, or the softness of aged paper. He did not often receive visitors. Once or twice a month, someone from the mayor's office might arrive, looking for a deed or an old land record. Elias would always find what they needed, but he did so slowly, methodically, as if disturbing the books too quickly might wake them. He treated the archive like a sleeping beast, gentle, mysterious, and deserving of respect. When no one came, which was most days, he simply sat at his desk, sipped lukewarm tea from a heavy ceramic mug, and listened to the silence. Elias's mornings were always the same. That sameness was, in fact, what he liked most about them. Once the candle was lit, and the dust had settled from his quiet arrival, he would place the large iron kettle onto the small cast-iron stove in the corner of the records room. The stove was old, even older than Elias, and made the occasional popping sound when warmed. The kettle took a long time to heat, but there was no rush. Elias would sit beside it in his wooden chair, slowly rocking back and forth, just enough to feel the faintest movement beneath him. The chair creaked ever so gently, not enough to be called a sound, more like a memory of a sound. While the water warmed, he would unfold his linen napkin, retrieve a small tin from the top drawer of his desk, and prepare his tea leaves. He always used the same blend, a mixture of dried chamomile and faintly floral black tea that he had ordered in bulk many years ago. He wasn't sure if it still tasted the same as it used to, but that didn't bother him. The act of making the tea mattered more than the tea itself. Once the tea was steeping precisely 4 minutes, never more, he would open the drawer labeled Daily Observations. Inside were rows of thick notebooks, each one dated and filled with his neat, slanted handwriting. He used these to record what he saw, what he heard, and sometimes, what he imagined. That day, though it could have been any day, he wrote, "The wind is from the north again, gentle, but persistent. The ivy on the southern wall has grown 1 hand's width since last month. The kettle took 11 minutes to boil, 12 if you count the time," it whispered. After writing his note, he closed the notebook and sipped his tea. It had cooled slightly, but that was fine. He liked his tea just above room temperature. The heat, he often said to himself, was not in the tea, but in the memory of it. He spent the rest of the morning indexing papers, not because anyone needed him to. No one had requested those files in over a decade, but because it gave his hands something to do. The process was slow, deliberate, and unchanging. He would remove one folder, check the label, smooth out the edges of the pages inside, and return it to the shelf with great care. Now and then, he would pause to look out. The small round window beside his desk, the glass was thick and wavy, so the world outside appeared soft and blurred, like a watercolor left in the rain. He liked that. The clarity of things didn't concern him anymore. Outside, nothing moved but the occasional falling leaf, or a wandering bird. The trees that lined the edge of the yard stood like sentinels, their bark pale and dry, their branches swaying gently, as if nodding in approval of his quiet rituals. The records room was, in many ways, the heart of Elias's world. It had no decorations, no clocks, no sound but the soft rustle of parchment and the occasional groan of the shelves as they shifted slightly under the weight of time. The shelves were built of thick, untreated wood, pine, perhaps, or some other pale timber that had darkened with age. Elias had once tried to count the total number of ledgers in the room, but somewhere around 417 he had stopped, not out of fatigue, but because, in his view, numbers did not matter as much as presence. What mattered was that the books were there, waiting, breathing quietly through the decades. Each ledger had its own weight, its own scent, its own feeling when handled. Some were smooth and light, their spines still stiff, their pages crisp. Others were heavy and soft, filled with the scent of damp paper and long-forgotten ink. Elias never rushed as he worked with them. He would take a book from the shelf, hold it in both hands for a moment, and then place it on the green felt mat that covered the center of his desk. There, he would open it slowly, as one might open a letter from a very old friend. Many of the records were mundane: lists of land parcels, shipments of grain, inventories of horseshoes, candles, and rope. But Elias read them with quiet devotion. The names in the ledgers were almost always unfamiliar merchants, clerks, distant farmers who had long since vanished from the town. Still, he treated each entry as though it contained some hidden importance. His finger would glide beneath each line of text, not quite touching the paper, as he mouthed the words silently to himself. 12 barrels of salted cod, received by Mr. Haverla. Signed the 4th of November, 1871. Request for repair. Window frame, southern office wing. Approved and filed, the 9th of February, 1866. Delivery of 6 crates, contents unspecified. Witnessed by E.W. Miles, assistant clerk. He never judged the dullness of the records. To Elias, dullness was not a flaw, it was a kind of beauty. The repetition, the formality, the sameness of the ink, and the loops of handwriting across the decades gave him a sense of calm that nothing else ever had. Sometimes, he imagined the people behind the signatures. He would give them quiet personalities, cautious, polite, always wearing gray. In his mind, they moved slowly through cobblestone streets, pausing to tip their hats or check the angle of the sun. He never imagined them speaking, just existing, gently, in the margins of time. The ink in some of the books had faded to a pale brown, and the paper had grown soft and fibrous. Elias had special gloves for those books. He wore them with reverence. lifting each page delicately, as if turning the wings of a sleeping moth. There was no rush, no goal to complete, no task to finish. There was only the act of touching the past, gently, respectfully, and with full attention. At noon, though he never checked the hour, Elias would rise and stretch. His knees would pop, softly, like distant twigs breaking in the forest. He would return each book to its shelf, running his hand along the edge of the binding before stepping back, as if saying thank you. He did not need to say anything aloud. The silence knew. After the slow, deliberate rituals of the morning, the afternoon hours arrived quietly, almost without notice. There were no bells in the records building, no ticking clocks, no sharp reminders of time passing. Only the soft movement of light on the stone floor, a long pale rectangle that shifted gently from east to west as the sun made its silent journey across the sky. Elias never checked a watch. He simply knew at some moment, perhaps just after the tea had cooled entirely, or after he had reviewed the third or fourth ledger of the day, he would rise from his chair and walk to the narrow window in the back corridor. From there, he could see the town's single cobbled road stretching off into the distance, flanked by shuttered buildings and crooked fences. There were rarely any people. A stray dog might wander past. A gust of wind might lift the corner of a tarp. But for the most part, the world outside remained still, not frozen, but comfortably paused. He stood at that window for exactly as long as he needed, sometimes 1 minute, sometimes 5. Then he would return to his desk, retrieve the small linen cloth he kept folded in his drawer, and begin wiping down the surfaces of the room, not because they were particularly dirty, but because the motion soothed him. First, he dusted the shelves, slow, clockwise circles, starting from the leftmost edge of the room, then the windowsill, then the tops of the books he had already read that morning, then the desk, then the wooden floorboards beneath his chair, though they never showed any real sign of dust. The cloth never seemed to get dirty, but he folded it carefully when he was done, smoothing out the corners, and returned it to its place. After cleaning, Elias would take a short walk down the long hallway that connected the archive room to the smaller back office. The hallway had 6 windows, 3 on each side, all covered in sheer linen curtains that moved very gently in the breeze. As he walked, Elias would count them silently, not because he might forget, but because the act of counting gave the hallway a rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The back office was nearly empty. A single desk, a locked cabinet, a stool that no one sat on anymore. Still, he visited it every day, just to ensure it remained as he left it. Stability, he believed, was a form of kindness, especially for places long left behind. Sometimes, he would sit on the stool and rest his hands on his knees. He wouldn't think of anything in particular. He would simply let his eyes drift across the cracked plaster on the far wall, tracing the faint hairline shapes that time had etched, their soft, branch-like paths that never seemed to grow but always seemed alive. There were no clocks, no calendars, no interruptions. Time passed not in moments but in feelings. The change of shadow on the wall, the deepening scent of old paper, the slow cooling of the air. Elias did not wait for the day to end. He merely followed it. As the afternoon faded, Elias began to notice the change in the light before he ever saw it. It wasn't sudden. It never was. The shift came slowly, like warm tea cooling in a cup, hardly noticeable from one moment to the next, but undeniable. Over time, the golden haze that had filled the records room all day grew softer, dimmer, and then warmer in tone, as if the sun, tired from its long journey, had dipped lower behind the hills and now cast light with gentler hands. Elias did not mind the coming of evening. He welcomed it in the same way one welcomes a familiar piece of music, not for its excitement, but for its predictability, its quiet rhythm. He adjusted the wick on the oil lamp that sat near the far end of the desk. It was one of 3 lamps in the building. but it was his favorite. The glass chimney had a tiny chip near the base, which refracted the flame into faint little patterns that danced on the ceiling when the room grew dark. He struck a match, slowly, holding it between his fingers a moment before touching it to the lamp's wick. The smell of sulfur lingered in the air for a second or two, a sharp contrast to the otherwise dusty, earthy scent of the room. But then it was gone, and the soft orange flame began its nightly vigil. With the lamp lit, Elias returned to his chair. He did not pick up another book. He simply sat. He liked to sit during the final hour of the day, doing nothing in particular, just observing. Sometimes he would stare at the flame. Sometimes he would watch the tiny motes of dust floating in the air, illuminated like stars in the narrow beam of lamplight. Sometimes he would listen to the wind pressing gently against the walls of the building, or the faint creak of timber adjusting to the cooling air. He was never bored. There was something to notice in every quiet corner of the evening. The way the shadows pooled beneath the shelves, the distant flutter of a bird settling into a tree outside, the muffled hum of the world growing still. He did not write during the evenings. That was a rule he had made for himself many years ago. Mornings were for recording, evenings were for remembering. And remembering, Elias believed, was best done in silence. He would close his eyes sometimes, not to sleep, but to see more clearly. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he could picture the shelves, the books, the texture of the paper, the feel of the linen cloth in his hand. He could trace the layout of the entire building in his mind. He could even recall the exact sound of a page turning crisp, steady, like the flap of a bird's wing. He sat that way until the flame began to flicker. When it did, he took it as his sign. The day had gone, the building had exhaled, and Elias, ever faithful, had watched over it once more. As the lamp's light wavered, Elias slowly rose from his chair. His movements were smooth, almost ceremonial, the way a caretaker might handle the final lock of a cathedral at dusk. He did not rush. He never rushed. Rushing would have made the day feel incomplete, cut short, unfinished. And in this building, where nothing ever hurried, where time moved like mist drifting over still water, endings had to arrive with care. He reached for the brass snuffer that hung from a small hook on the side of the desk. It was cool to the touch, shaped like a tiny bell at the end of a long handle. With practiced grace, he lowered it over the flame of the oil lamp. A brief flicker, a faint hiss, and then darkness. Not a harsh darkness, but a soft one, padded with memory and the distant comfort of routine. For a moment, Elias simply stood there, letting his eyes adjust. The outlines of shelves and cabinets slowly returned, bathed now in the bluish haze of twilight leaking in through the windows. He didn't need much light. He knew where everything was. The room was more familiar to him than his own reflection. He walked to the window at the far end of the room and looked outside one last time. The trees were now black silhouettes against a sky of quiet lavender. A single star blinked near the horizon. Far off, a chimney released a thread of smoke into the cooling air. Somewhere in the distance, perhaps from the edge of the forest, came the sound of a nightbird, calling low, echoing, and solitary dot. Elias watched until the star grew brighter. Then he turned and began his closing rituals. First he closed the ledger on his desk and placed it gently back into its assigned place on the shelf. His fingers lingered on the spine for a second, tapping twice, not as a habit, but as a farewell. He then moved to the cabinet near the hallway and ensured its drawers were flush, aligned, quiet. Nothing was ever out of place, but he checked, all the same. Next came the back office. He walked there slowly, counting the windows again as he passed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He paused in the doorway, glancing once more at the stool, the desk, the empty cabinet. Everything was still, as he'd left it. Satisfied, he turned and retraced his steps, each footstep measured, each breath soft. Finally, He approached the front of the building, where the heavy wooden door waited, already leaning closed under its own weight. Elias reached for the key around his neck. The metal was cool and smooth, shaped by years of turning in the same lock. He inserted it, turned it slowly, one click, then another, and the door sealed with a sound like a sigh. He remained there a moment, hand resting on the wood, as if listening. Then he stepped outside. The air had cooled. The scent of earth and distant leaves filled his lungs. The street was empty, the way it always was at this hour, not abandoned. Just resting. As he walked down the quiet path, the building stood behind him, its windows faintly aglow from the memory of the day. Elias didn't look back. He never did. The building would be there tomorrow, and so would he. The path from the records building to Elias's house was not long. It wound gently through the older part of dry wood, past shuttered storefronts, iron lampposts, and stone walls lined with moss. The ground was uneven in places, worn by time, softened by decades of quiet footsteps, but Elias knew every dip and rise, every loose cobblestone and puddle-shaped hollow. He walked with his hands behind his back, fingers lightly interlaced, shoulders relaxed. The sky above had turned a dusky blue, streaked with long silvery clouds that drifted slowly like sails on a motionless sea. The first stars were out, not twinkling, just resting, suspended. He liked this part of the day, not because it was exciting, nothing about Elias's days ever was, but because it was complete. The building was closed. The ledgers were back in their place. The lamp was extinguished. His duties, small, unimportant, and wholly his, were done. There was something deeply satisfying in that, a quiet order, a rhythm. Along the way, he passed the tailor's shop. The shutters were drawn, but the sign, Winfield and Sons, tailoring since 1823, still hung neatly over the door. Elias nodded to it, though no one was there to see. He nodded to most buildings out of habit. They had stood for so long, he felt they deserved the courtesy. The bakery came next. It hadn't opened in 12 years, but sometimes, when the air was damp and the wind came from the east, he imagined he could still smell faint traces of flour, sugar, and warmth lingering in the stones. Elias didn't hurry. There was no reason to. The street lamp near the old post office flickered on with a soft click, casting a circular pool of amber light onto the cobbles. He paused beneath it, tilting his head back just slightly to watch the moths begin their nightly dance around the flame. They moved in looping patterns, not frantic, not still, just ... drifting, like thoughts that never quite settle. A breeze stirred the air, cool and light, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and dry leaves. Somewhere a gate creaked open. Somewhere else, a window was shut with a soft thud. These sounds, ordinary, dull, barely there, formed the music of his walk. They asked nothing of him. They simply filled the silence with texture. By the time he reached the low stone wall that bordered his garden, the moon had appeared, pale, thin, almost shy. Elias opened the gate with the same care he gave to everything. It squeaked faintly, as it always did, and swung shut behind him with a gentle clack. He didn't need to latch it. It knew how to stay closed. Elias's home was as quiet as the building he had left behind, perhaps quieter. It was a modest cottage, made of pale stone with a pitched roof of gray slate. Nothing about it was particularly remarkable. There were no flowers in the yard, no ornaments by the door, no signs of recent activity. It looked, to anyone passing by, like a place paused in time, but inside, it was still alive in the slow, quiet way Elias loved best. He stepped through the front door and paused just inside the threshold. He always did. The wooden floor creaked gently beneath his feet, and the scent of the house wrapped around him, a blend of dried herbs, paper, and wool blankets. It was not a scent that could be described easily. It was simply the scent of his life. He took off his shoes and lined them up with great care beside the door, not because anyone would see them, but because placing them neatly helped him feel like the day had landed properly. Then he hung his coat on its hook, the third one from the left, and straightened the hem where it sagged slightly from age. The main room of the house was small, square, and dimly lit by the silver light of the moon filtering in through lace curtains. Against the far wall stood a single bookshelf, filled not with novels or poetry, but with notebooks, plain, cloth-bound journals he had filled over the years with observations, sketches, and quiet thoughts. He didn't read them often. Knowing they were there was enough. To the left of the room was the hearth. Though the fire hadn't been lit that day, the ashes of the previous night still held a faint warmth. Elias knelt slowly, added 2 logs, and lit them with a taper from the mantel. The flames took quickly, rising with a soft hiss, casting gentle shadows across the walls like flickering reflections in a pool. He placed the kettle on the small trivet by the fire and settled into his chair, a wide, padded seat with one worn arm and a cushion that remembered the shape of his body. The chair made a faint sigh as he leaned back. It always did. From a small drawer beside him, he drew out another linen napkin and unfolded it. Inside was a small biscuit, oat and honey, wrapped carefully in wax paper. He took small bites, chewing slowly, listening to the quiet ticking of the wind against the window panes. He did not read. He did not write. The day was done. Elias stared into the fire and let his thoughts drift like smoke. Not toward the future. He made no plans, and not toward the past either. Just inward, toward the feeling of stillness. A sort of warm emptiness. Not sadness. Not even peace. Just the absence of needing anything. The kettle began to whistle. Not loudly, just a soft breath. He poured the water into his cup, added a spoonful of dried mint, and waited. The tea turned pale green. The warmth from the mug reached his fingers, slowly, seeping into his skin like evening dew, soaking into the grass outside. The wind shifted. Inside, Elias closed his eyes. The tea was still warm in Elias's hands, though he no longer drank it. He simply held the cup, feeling its fading heat. Outside, the wind whispered through the dry branches of the trees, a soft sound, like the pages of a book being turned very, very slowly. Inside, the fire had settled into its quieter phase, no longer crackling, but glowing. Orange embers pulsed gently at the base of the hearth, like coals breathing in sleep. The shadows on the walls no longer danced. They rested, stretched long and still, like blankets laid over furniture. Elias leaned back further into the chair and exhaled through his nose. Not a sigh of sadness, just release. He looked up at the ceiling, not at anything in particular, just into the dim patterns of wood and plaster. In the faint light, he could make out the familiar stain near the chimney shaped vaguely like a bird in flight. He had seen it for years and had never tried to clean it. He didn't want to disturb it. It was part of the house now, part of the quiet company that filled the silence. Sometimes, in these late hours, thoughts would pass through his mind like slow-moving clouds. Not memories, exactly, more like feelings without words. The texture of old paper, the coolness of ink drying on a page, the sound of a door gently closing, the weight of a coat on his shoulders in winter. He didn't hold on to them. He just let them pass. A page turning, a lantern swaying, footsteps on stone, a chair shifting, wind in the eaves, silence. He didn't dream the way he used to, not in pictures or stories. His dreams had faded over the years into something softer, like fog over the hills, like dust settling in a room where no one speaks. Sometimes, he wasn't even sure if he was dreaming or simply floating, hovering at the edge of thought, at the edge of sleep, where everything is slow and nothing needs a name. The tea had cooled entirely now, and the fire had sunk into a bed of soft red coals. Elias stood, carefully, quietly, and walked to the back of the house. The floor beneath him creaked once. He paused, then he moved on. His bedroom was small, just a bed, a table, a lamp, and the same window he had looked through every night for 40 years. He lit the lamp with a match, the last one in the box, and watched the tiny flame rise. The light filled the room with a pale gold warmth, and then settled. He sat on the edge of the bed, unlaced his shoes, folded his shirt, and placed his glasses on the table. Then he pulled the covers back and lay down, arms resting gently on his chest, like someone preparing not for sleep, but for rest, the kind of rest that begins before dreaming, before thought. The last thing he saw was the ceiling, smooth and unchanging. The last thing he heard was the wind in the trees. The last thing he felt was the weight of the blanket, not heavy, but certain. And then, like everything in Drywood, he drifted into stillness. Outside Elias's cottage, the wind had quieted. The streets of Drywood, already still by day, now sank into a deeper silence, a hush that wasn't empty, but full of the soundlessness of night, the weightless drift of hours that asked for nothing and promised only rest. The houses along the lane stood like patient sentinels, their windows dim or dark, their doors latched. Wooden signs above shuttered shops swayed just slightly in the breeze, creaking now and then, not enough to wake anything, but enough to remind the world they were still there. The trees, bare of leaves now, held their branches out like arms, stretched wide in sleep. The moon, faint behind thin clouds, cast its pale light unevenly across rooftops, fences, and stone walls. Everything looked softer in that light, blurred at the edges, like a memory of a place rather than the place itself. Somewhere, far off, a dog barked once. Then, nothing. The lamp by the corner of the old bakery flickered, then steadied. Moths circled it slowly, their wings catching the glow like paper kites adrift in a warm current. A cat crossed the empty street, its steps silent, its path known only to itself. The night allowed it to pass without question. Beneath it all, beneath stone and wood, beneath earth and root, time itself seemed to sleep. Drywood had never been loud, even in its younger days. When carts moved through the center square and laughter spilled from windows, it had always carried a kind of stillness within it. Now, that stillness was everything. Not loneliness, not abandonment, just ... quiet. And in that quiet, the town rested. The river at the edge of the valley moved slowly, its waters dark and smooth, reflecting the moon in broken lines. The hills beyond rose like the backs of sleeping beasts, unmoving, unwatching, untroubled. In the cottage at the end of the lane, Elias slept deeply, soundlessly, just as the buildings did, just as the ledgers did, just as everything in Drywood did when the light had gone, and there was nothing left to do but rest. The night passed, not with events, but with the slow turning of the earth beneath stars, too distant to notice. And somewhere, without urgency, a new day waited, but not yet, not now. Now was for sleeping, now was for stillness, now was for silence.